The global economy feels like it's teetering on an edge right now. Everywhere you look, there's talk of instability, inflation, and debt. It's a feeling that resonates deeply when you look back at history, because while the details might change, the core story of economic booms and busts has played out countless times before. We're not predicting a collapse here, but it's hard to ignore the observable trends that echo past eras. As John Kenneth Galbraith once put it, the process of inflation, it is said, is like that of original sin. Everyone is against it, but everyone practices it. He was talking about the illusion of perpetual prosperity, a belief that somehow, this time, things will keep going up without consequences. But let's look at some numbers that paint a different picture, especially for the United States. The national debt has soared past $34 trillion. Inflation, while it might be cooling slightly, has eroded purchasing power significantly over the last few years. And interest rates, after years of being near zero, have jumped, making that massive debt even more expensive to service. When you see these figures, it's hard not to feel the weight of it all. There's a quiet understanding that something fundamental is shifting. It reminds you of that old saying, history rarely repeats itself, but it often rhymes. We've seen empires rise and fall, their economic foundations crumbling under the weight of unsustainable practices. What does this mean for American financial dominance? Is its future as secure as its past? Before we dive deeper into that question, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from all corners of the globe. To truly understand where we are today, we have to rewind the clock, all the way back to a time when the world was trying to pick up the pieces after a devastating war. It was a period of immense change, opportunity, and also a deep desire for stability that had been missing for decades. The pre-World War II global economic landscape was frankly a mess. Imagine a world without a consistent, reliable way to trade across borders. Countries operated with their own distinct currencies, often with wildly fluctuating values. Trade was complicated, risky, and prone to sudden disruptions. There was no single, universally accepted reserve currency. If you wanted to do business internationally, you were constantly navigating a maze of exchange rates, gold shipments, and unstable financial systems. This fragmentation made global commerce slow and inefficient, and it contributed to the economic instability that helped set the stage for conflicts. The chaos of the interwar years, marked by protectionism, competitive devaluations, and a lack of international monetary cooperation, showed everyone just how fragile the global economy could be. Currencies were often tied to a gold standard, but even that was frequently suspended during times of crisis, leading to uncertainty. The system was a patchwork, often driven by national self-interest rather than global cooperation. It was a world where trust in monetary systems was low, and economic rivalries often spilled over into geopolitical tensions. This was the backdrop against which a new vision for global finance began to take shape, a vision that would fundamentally reshape the world and place one nation at its undisputed economic center for decades to come. The simplicity and perceived stability that this new system promised were incredibly appealing after so much turmoil. This was the environment that led to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. Representatives from 44 allied nations gathered in New Hampshire, determined to create a more stable and predictable international monetary system. The goal was to prevent future economic depressions and foster global trade by establishing a fixed exchange rate system with the US dollar at its heart. The dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. This meant other currencies were fixed against the dollar, and the dollar was the only one directly convertible to gold. For a war-weary world, this system offered a beacon of stability. The US, emerging from the war largely unscathed, and with the vast majority of the world's gold reserves, was in a unique position to lead this new order. The years following Bretton Woods saw unprecedented economic growth and stability. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, facilitating international trade and investment. Countries accumulated dollar reserves, knowing they could be converted to gold if needed, even though most rarely did. It felt like a solid foundation for a new global era. But even the most robust foundations can develop cracks over time. especially when subjected to new pressures and changing realities. As the 1950s and 60s progressed, the global economic landscape began to shift in subtle yet significant ways. One of the first signs of accumulated tension came with the remarkable recovery of European economies and Japan. Fueled by Marshall Plan aid and their own industriousness, countries like West Germany and Japan rebuilt their industries and became formidable economic competitors. This was a good thing for global prosperity, but it also meant the US was no longer the sole economic powerhouse. Their exports soared, and they began accumulating significant dollar reserves. The balance of payments started to tilt, with more dollars flowing out of the US than flowing in. This wasn't an immediate crisis, but it was a quiet signal that the world was becoming more economically balanced. Then came the Vietnam War. This conflict proved to be an immense drain on US resources. The cost of financing the war, combined with increased social spending at home, led to rising inflation and a growing budget deficit. As dollars flooded the global market, foreign central banks, now holding vast quantities of US currency, began to question the dollar's convertibility to gold. They started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, putting immense pressure on US gold reserves. The gold window was starting to creak under the strain. The tension reached a breaking point in 1971. Faced with dwindling gold reserves and a crisis of confidence in the dollar, President Richard Nixon made a dramatic announcement. The United States would unilaterally abandon the gold standard. This move, known as the Nixon shock, severed the dollar's direct link to gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. It was a monumental decision, sending ripples of uncertainty through global financial markets. The fixed exchange rate system gave way to floating rates, and the world entered an era of pure fiat currency. This was a moment of deep emotional cracks in the global financial system. The assurance of gold backing, however symbolic it had become, was gone. This shift meant central banks now held dollar reserves based purely on trust in the US economy and its government. The initial stability of Bretton Woods was replaced by a new kind of uncertainty. Then, just 2 years later, the first oil crisis hit in 1973. OPEC nations, in response to geopolitical events, dramatically increased oil prices. This not only sent shockwaves through the global economy, but also highlighted a new reality. Energy was now a critical factor in global finance, and its price was largely denominated in US dollars. This created a new demand for dollars, even without gold backing. But it also introduced another layer of vulnerability and geopolitical complexity. The global financial system was undergoing a profound transformation. The shift from gold convertibility to a purely fiat system fundamentally altered how central banks managed their reserves and how international trade operated. Global debt began to tick upwards, becoming a more accepted, almost normal, part of the economic landscape. Nations, particularly smaller ones, started having quiet discussions about diversifying their reserves, subtly indicating a burgeoning distrust in the absolute, unshakable stability of the dollar. The cracks were no longer just forming, they were becoming visible. The world was in flux, and the United States, despite having severed the dollar's link to gold, found a new way to solidify its financial dominance: oil. In the 1970s, a strategic decision was made, a pivot that would redefine global finance. The US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, ensuring that oil would be bought and sold exclusively in US dollars. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, a brilliant move that ensured continued global demand for the dollar, even without its gold backing. The mechanics were simple yet powerful. Countries around the world needed oil to fuel their economies, and to buy that oil, they needed US dollars. This meant they had to acquire dollars, either by exporting goods to the US or by borrowing them. These dollars, once earned or borrowed, often found their way back into US financial markets, particularly into US Treasury bonds. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Global demand for oil created global demand for dollars, which in turn financed US spending and kept interest rates low. This allowed the US to run significant trade deficits and print currency without immediate inflationary collapse, as those dollars were continuously recycled through the global economy. For decades, the petrodollar system worked, cementing the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. However, this seemingly impenetrable system began to face new economic challenges. The 2008 financial crisis was a stark reminder of the interconnectedness and vulnerability of a dollar-centric world. What started as a housing market collapse in the US quickly rippled across the globe, demonstrating how deeply intertwined global economies had become with the American financial system. Trust, once abundant, began to fray at the edges. In the years that followed, a new force emerged on the global stage: the BRICS nations, an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries, representing a significant portion of the world's population and economic output, began to actively explore alternatives to the dollar-dominated financial system. They discussed trading in local currencies, establishing alternative payment systems, and even creating their own reserve currencies. This wasn't just talk. It was a direct, albeit gradual, challenge to the petrodollar's reign. Another factor accelerating this shift was the increasing use of sanctions as a tool of US foreign policy. While effective in specific geopolitical contexts, these sanctions often had an unintended consequence. They pushed sanctioned nations, and even those wary of potential future sanctions, to seek financial independence from the dollar. Countries began diversifying their reserves, reducing their reliance on dollar-denominated assets, and exploring non-dollar trade routes. This accelerated the de-dollarization efforts, making the global financial landscape more fragmented. Simultaneously, the global debt burden continued to swell, exacerbated by central bank policies like quantitative easing, especially post-2008. These policies, designed to stimulate economies, flooded the market with liquidity, raising concerns about long-term currency stability and inflation. The implications for currency stability were profound, adding another layer of uncertainty to the dollar's future. The narrative concludes not with a sudden collapse, but with a reflective analysis of an ongoing gradual shift in global financial power. The US remains a dominant force, its economy robust, its innovation engine strong. However, the unipolar financial world it once commanded is slowly but surely evolving into a more multipolar one. This change is systemic, affecting global trade, investment, and geopolitical influence in a complex, non-catastrophic manner. It's a rebalancing, a diffusion of power rather than a transfer. The sun may not set on the American financial empire, but its light is undoubtedly diffusing across a new global dawn.